Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. There's even a brand new Brigadier General tier where you can get a shout out on a Commander's Quarters episode that's dedicated to you. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So on today's episode, I'm going to be taking you through a complete tier ranking of the Innistrad Midnight Hunt Commanders. This includes both the main set as well as the Midnight Hunt precons. So we're going to be starting off in Tier D, which is the weakest tier, and work our way through C, B, and A, all the way up to the most powerful tier, which is Tier S. Just a quick disclaimer before we jump into this. Obviously, these tier rankings are based off of my own opinions, and your picks might differ for these, and that's okay. Also, these tier rankings are going to be done within the vacuum of Innistrad Midnight Hunt, as in, they're going to be comparisons between the commanders of this set compared to each other, and not compared to outside commanders. So for example, an S-tier commander from this set might be an A-tier commander when compared to commanders from another set. Again, this is the power levels of the commanders from this set and the precon in comparison to each other. Also, within each tier, the commanders that I'm bringing up are in no particular order. So the first commander that I bring up in a tier is not necessarily stronger or weaker than the last commander I bring up in that tier or any other commander in that tier. And as always, a huge thank you to Eddie for all your help during spoiler season and the great discussions around these commanders. And as always, if I make any mistakes in this episode or any of my other episodes, always make sure you blame Eddie in the comments below because it's always Eddie's fault and not mine. And with all that said, let's jump into it. So let's start things off with the lowest tier, the weakest commanders from the set and precons with Tier D. And to start off the D tier, we've got Kerbis, Harvest Celebrant. Kerbis is a 0/0 tree folk for X green green, and it enters the battlefield a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. By removing a +1/+1 counter from Kerbis, you prevent all damage to be dealt this turn to another target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. Okay, so that first part obviously isn't all that bad. It takes into account commander attacks and those additional mana pips, so yes, getting a good amount of counters on this is obviously a good thing. Where this commander is very weak, though, is how those counters are used. Essentially, the payoff for removing one of the counters from this commander is just preventing damage to another target creature, and that creature has to have another +1/+1 counter on it. So that's pretty specific and pretty weak. Sure, if someone casts a damage-based board wipe, you can probably save most of your team as long as you've got enough counters on this and counters on your creatures, but you also can't even save your commander because it can't target itself. Obviously, this can help somewhat in combat as well, but again, you're going to need a lot of counters to actually use this over and over again. So again, a very underwhelming and pretty specific ability that really isn't all that impactful. So yes, because of all this, Kerbis, you most definitely belong in the D tier. You had some potential with that first part, and then with the actual application of your counters, well, you're in the D tier. Next up, though, let's move on to another commander that most definitely had some potential, but fell short with Gorax the Tomb Shell. Gorax is a 4/4 zombie turtle with Death Touch that costs 6 black. It has as initial cost to cast this spell, you may exile any number of creature cards from your graveyard. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way. And then whenever Gorax the Tomb Shell attacks or dies, choose a card at random, exile with Gorax, and put that card into its owner's hand. So with enough creature cards in your graveyard, you can essentially keep casting this for 2 mana, even counting commander attacks into the equation. Now that's pretty cool and could be pretty powerful, except for the lackluster application of that, which is, hey, if this attacks or dies, you get a random card back, but into your hand. So a 4/4 commander with Death Touch that can just occasionally get us back a creature from our graveyard into our hand is not a powerful thing. Obviously, if it reanimated that random creature, even if that creature had to be given something like Decayed, that would be a different story. But yeah, just giving us back that random creature to our hand is not great. So Gorax, like Kerbis, you had a lot of potential, but at the very end, you fell flat. So much like Kerbis, you now find yourself solidly in the D tier. But now let's move away from the tree folk and the zombie turtle and onto the human soldier with Dennick, Pious Apprentice. Dennis is a 2/3 with lifelink that costs white-blue. He has cards in graveyards can't be the targets of spells or abilities, and he's got a disturb cost of 2 white-blue, so you can cast from your graveyard, transform for its disturb cost. It transforms into Dennick, Pious Apparition, a 3/2 with flying that says, whenever one or more creature cards are put in your graveyards from anywhere, investigate. This ability triggers only once each turn. And if Dennis will be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So, and I feel like a broken record at this point, but this commander, like the other two that I've already mentioned, seemed to have a lot of potential, but fell flat. And the reason that this one came up short was literally just the sentence, this ability triggers only once each turn. This takes away all the potential of this commander and makes it incredibly weak. If you were able to create more than one clue token on a turn, you could do a lot of powerful things with this commander in an artifact build. Unfortunately with this commander though, that's not the case. So yeah, having to jump through the hoops of getting this commander out, getting it into your graveyard, casting it for its disturb cost, and then trying to make one clue token a turn with it is not worth it. So again, because of those 7 words, this ability triggers only once each turn. Dennick, you are our final commander in the D tier. But now it's time for us to move away from the lowest tier with the D tier and move on to the second lowest tier with the C tier. And starting off the C tier, we've got Jadar, Ghoulcaller of Nephalia. Jadar is a 1/1 human wizard that costs 1 and a black, and he has at the beginning of your end step, if you control no creatures with Decayed, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. And Decayed is a new mechanic from this set. It means that it can't block, and when it attacks, sacrifice it at the end of combat. So essentially this commander can keep giving you temporary tokens. Again, I say temporary because if you don't sacrifice them or attack with them, you're not going to be getting another one. So it's kind of like a really weak version of Bitter Blossom / kind of more so like a Dreadhorde Invasion. I mean, that's pretty underwhelming. Now, obviously there are ways to build around this to get a lot of value out of those tokens, but there are plenty of other commanders out there that are more effective at actually making you even more tokens more quickly. Or just overall in general providing a lot more value than this commander provides you. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this commander, it's just not very powerful. And because of that, Jadar, you are the very first commander that I am bringing up in the C tiers, so congratulations, I guess? Next up, we've got a mono-white commander with Adeline, Resplendent Cathar. Go figure, a mono-white commander in one of the lower tiers. How original. Adeline is a star 4 human knight with vigilance that costs 1 white. Her power is equal to the number of creatures you control, and whenever you attack for each opponent, create a 1/1 white human creature token that's tapped and attacking that player or a planeswalker they control. First of all, this commander is combat dependent, so you've got to put it in harm's way to actually get value out of it. And while the power does increase with the more creatures that you get in play, the toughness stays the same. So without help, this commander and the tokens that it creates can easily be taken out in combat. And again, if you can't swing, you're not getting any value out of this commander. Commanders that need to attack to have value and don't inherently have any form of evasion tend to be pretty weak. Now, the payoff of getting 3 creatures in play is nice, and though sometimes it's going to be impactful that they're already tapped and attacking a player, sometimes that's going to be a bad thing. If each opponent has enough defenses up, you might just lose all those tokens that you just made. And again, this is a payoff that gets weaker and weaker the longer the game goes and the less opponents that there are. So for all those reasons, Adeline, you have made it into the C tier. I mean, as a mono-white commander, just congratulations for not being in the D tier, I guess. But now let's move forward and talk about Sereth the Viper's Fang. Sereth is a 3/4 human warlock that costs 2 green. She has other tapped creatures you control have Death Touch, other untapped creatures you control have Hexproof, and by paying 1 you can tap her to untap another target creature or land you control. So while I do like the design of this commander and it's pretty unique, I just don't think it's all that powerful. Death Touch is obviously nice in combat when you're attacking to help get your creatures through or to make them deadlier. But there is this kind of trade-off again where if you attack with your creatures, they're going to be susceptible to target removal then because they no longer have that hexproof that your commander would have been giving them. Obviously, you can untap them in response to someone targeting them with a spell, but then they're losing their Death Touch again, so there's this kind of interesting push and pull with this commander that again makes it unique, but not all that powerful. So Sereth, though I really like your design, unfortunately you're not a very powerful commander and you have found your way into the C tier. But now it's time for us to move onward and upward. I mean, not out of the C tier, I just mean upward into the sky because it's a creature with flying. Okay, that was bad. Anyways, Rem Carlos Stalwart Slayer is a 2/3 human knight with flying and haste, and it says if a spell would deal damage to you or another permanent you control, prevent that damage. And if a spell would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. So like some of the other commanders that I mentioned before, this commander actually had a good amount of potential. It was just pretty much ruined by one thing. And actually, one word, really, and that word is another. Since Rem Carlos does not prevent damage to itself, you really have to build around getting something that will help prevent damage to itself so you can actually build the deck in the way that it really wants to be built. And of course, that would be with damage-based board wipes and mass burn spells. Again, yourself as well as your team are protected, but Rem Carlos isn't unless you actually go get something that gives it indestructible or protection from red, etc., etc. And again, without protecting itself, this can just be really lackluster and this commander can fall flat on its face. So Rem, you definitely had the potential to fly into one of the higher tiers, but because of that one simple word, another, you are stuck in C. Next up though, let's move on to Lind, Cheerful Tormentor. Lind is a 2/4 human warlock with Death Touch that costs 1 blue, black, red. She has, whenever a curse is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, return to the battlefield attached to you at the beginning of the next end step, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may attach a curse attached to you to one of your opponents. If you do, draw 2 cards. So, Lind is our very first commander that is specifically dedicated to curses. In fact, I believe she's the only commander that actually even mentions them. Now, that is really exciting, and I actually really do like the design of this commander, but she's really not all that powerful because of one simple thing. Yes, if you attached a lot of curses to one player and that player loses the game, you do get those curses back, which is huge. But the major point and the major downside of this commander is those curses come back attached to you. So now with every single curse that you had attached to an opponent and all the ways that you were punishing them, you are now getting punished. And obviously, depending on what curses are now attached to you, this can make you a huge target and really hamper your plans. Now there are ways to play around with this and temporarily get rid of those curses, but still, it's a major downside that they come back into play attached to you. Now again, I like the design and it's flavorful and you can get rid of those curses, but it's going to be pretty slow. Again, at the beginning of your upkeep, you can move one of those curses attached to you to one of your opponents and draw 2 cards, and that card advantage is nice, but again, this is kind of a slow pace, especially if you had a lot of curses attached to a player that lost. It's going to take quite a long time to move 7 or so curses off of you onto your opponents. So again, because of all these things, Lind, Cheerful Tormentor, you have finished in the C tier. C for curses. That works, right? Anyways. Now let's move on to the final commander from the C tier with Sigarda, Champion of Light. Sigarda is a 4/4 angel with Flample, or in other words, Flying and Trample, and she costs 1 green, white, white. She has humans you control get ++1 and Coven. When Sigarda attacks, if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a human creature card from among them and put it in your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, much like Adeline, this commander depends on an attack trigger. Now, this commander does have flying, so that is a form of evasion that can help get it through, but still. This commander is attack trigger dependent, and you're not guaranteed to get that attack trigger even again because you need to have 3 or more creatures with different powers. Now that payoff is nice, but it can still whiff as well, and again, it's very specific. So yeah, for a human tribal commander that is dependent upon an attack trigger that is conditional and might not even provide any value, yeah, Sigarda, you most definitely round out the C tier. But now it's time for us to move out of the C tier and into those middle-of-the-road commanders in the B tier. And to start off those middle-of-the-road commanders, let's talk about another commander with Coven, which I really think is an underwhelming mechanic. I really don't like it very much. So that very well might be why these commanders that have it are nowhere near the higher tiers. Regardless, Lenore is a 0/4 human noble that costs 2 green, white. Again, she has Coven. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a ++1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. Then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, draw a card. So getting a counter on one creature obviously is not all that powerful of a thing. Now, yes, this can help you meet that Coven requirement, but still it's not guaranteed. And again, if you do meet that Coven requirement, your payoff is draw a card. Yes, card advantage is nice, but this is not guaranteed card advantage, and it's not going to be consistent card advantage. So a potential draw engine in the command zone that can also give out some counters. Yeah, Lenore, to me, you have finished in the B tier. Next up, though, let's talk about a very different commander that also belongs in the B tier with Ludovic, Necro Genius. Ludovic is a 2/3 human wizard that costs blue-black. It has, when it enters the battlefield or attacks, mill a card. And by paying X blue blue black black, you exile X creature cards from your graveyard, transform Ludovic, X can't be 0, activate only as a sorcery. Ludovic transforms into Olag Ludovic's Hubris. Olag is a 4/4 zombie, and as this creature transforms into Olag, it becomes a copy of a creature card exiled with it, except its name is Olag Ludovic's Hubris. It's a 4/4, it's legendary, blue and black zombie, in addition to other colors and types. Put a number of +1 counters on Olag equal to the number of creature cards exiled with it. So to be completely honest, this commander seemed to have a good amount of potential when just reading the front half of the card. But for all that investment of having to get creatures in your graveyard and paying X blue blue black black, which is not cheap, and exiling those creature cards, the payoff is just underwhelming. You get to clone one creature from your graveyard, and it might be slightly bigger than what it was. That's basically it. Again, that's a lot of work for not a lot of payoff, and I mean, in comparison, something like Mimeoplasm is just so much better. So again, like a lot of the other commanders on this list, Ludovic had a lot of potential. But at the end, Ludovic, you fell flat, and though you might be a Necro genius, you're also very much in the B tier. But now let's move on to another Dimir commander in the B tier with Wilhelt the Rot Cleaver. Wilhelt is a 3/3 zombie warrior that costs 2 blue black. He has whenever another zombie you control dies, if it didn't have Decayed, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. And at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a zombie. If you do, draw a card. So this commander actually has a good amount of things going on for it. With a zombie tribal specific build, you can get a lot of value out of this commander. Obviously though, you do need a good amount of setup to really make the most of it. If you can get set up with ways to make a lot of zombie tokens and ways to sacrifice them and get value out of sacrificing them, yeah, you can do a lot of powerful things with this. In my opinion, this is most definitely not a bad commander. It's just one that seems to be middle of the road and outclassed by other commanders in this set and the precons. So my apologies, Wilhelt, you do have an awesome name being the Rot Cleaver, but you are also in the B tier. But now let's move on to yet another Dimir commander with Eloise Nephalia Sleuth. Yeah, apparently all the Dimir commanders just landed right in the middle. I promise that wasn't intentional, but it's kind of funny to look back at. Regardless, Eloise is a 4/4 human rogue that costs 3 blue black. She has whenever another creature you control dies, investigate. And whenever you sacrifice a token, surveil 1. So Eloise is actually a really unique commander and one that can be decently powerful because it was made without certain limitations. First off, Eloise could very easily have said whenever another non-token creature you control dies, investigate, but it doesn't say that. Because of that, if you make a bunch of token creatures, you can sacrifice them and get a lot of value, making a lot of clues. And again, essentially you're getting double value because it says whenever you sacrifice a token, surveil 1. So again, by making a token creature and sacrificing it, first off, you're investigating, and secondly, you're surveilling 1. Again, that second part could have very easily said whenever you sacrifice a clue, surveil 1, but it doesn't. So again, because this commander doesn't have those restrictions on it, you can actually build it in a pretty powerful way with kind of like an artifact token strategy. And when you flood the board and sacrifice a ton of artifacts, there's some really cool things that you can do. So Eloise, thanks to your lack of limitations, you have fit solidly in the B tier. And speaking of a solid B tier commander, let's move on to Liesa Forgotten Archangel. Liesa is a 4/5 angel with flying and lifelink that costs 2 white black. She has whenever another non-token creature you control dies, return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. And if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. This is just a very solid value-producing commander. If your non-token creatures die, you're going to get them back, though it is delayed on when you do. Obviously, if this gave your creatures back right away to your hand, that would be much more powerful, but it is still pretty good the way it is. And if you've got ways to get those creatures right back into play, maybe if those creatures have flash, yes, you can get some additional value out of this on each turn. Even so, even just getting them back to your hand, being able to recast them on your next turn can be very impactful. And again, on top of that, this can most definitely host some graveyard strategies that your opponents might have because of that second part. And keep in mind that this can also shut down some death triggers as well, but also keep in mind with that this also shuts down your own, maybe like a Blood Artist, because it's not going to be counting your opponent's creatures dying because they're exiled instead. Overall, this is just a very solid B tier commander that isn't overpowered, but is pretty powerful. So don't worry, Liesa Forgotten Archangel, I have not forgotten about you. Okay, that was bad. Anyways, moving on to Florian Valderin Scion. Florian is a 3/3 vampire noble with first strike that costs 1 black-red. Florian has, at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the total amount of life your opponents lost this turn. Exile one of those cards and put the rest of the bottom of your library in a random order. You may play the exiled card this turn. So, obviously, if you just dish out some combat damage, that can most definitely help with this commander, getting you a card off the top. But a more impactful way to build around this commander is probably to just dish out damage in other more consistent ways, maybe like a tapper that deals damage to all your opponents or to every player, etc, etc. The more damage that you consistently dish out, the more you can dig into your deck, and it kind of becomes like a mini tutor in a way. So you can go find the right card for the situation that you're in, utilize it, and then next turn dish out even more damage to dig even further for an even better card. So yeah, one setup you can really get things going with this commander, and it's most definitely a B tier commander in my mind. But now let's move on to the final commander in the B tier with Jaren Corrupted Bishop / Ormondal the Corruptor. Jaren is a 2/3 human cleric that costs 2 and a black, and it has when it enters the battlefield or another human you control dies, you lose 1 life and create a 1/1 white human creature token. By paying 2, target human you control gains lifelink until end of turn, and at the beginning of your end step if you have exactly 13 life you may pay 4 black if you do transform Jaren. Jaren transforms into Ormondal the Corruptor, a 6/6 demon with flying, trample, lifelink, and sacrifice another creature, draw a card. So obviously the backside of that card can be incredibly impactful, again a free sacrifice outlet that provides card advantage. But obviously to get the most out of this commander, you need to get down to 13 life and transform it. Now, Jaren can obviously help you get there in a way by helping you lose life and gain life in different ways, but obviously there are more efficient ways to get down to exactly 13 life, and actually you can do that pretty quickly. And actually, if that end step trigger didn't also include paying 4 black, I might bump this one up another tier. Because obviously, a 6/6 flying trample lifelink free sacrifice outlet value engine is obviously pretty impactful. But since you actually have to work to get there and pay to get there, it's in the B tier. But now let's bump up the power level by moving from those middle-of-the-road B-tier commanders into the A-tier commanders. And to start things off in the A-tier, let's talk about Katilda Dawnheart Prime. Katilda is a 1/1 human warlock with protection from werewolves that costs green-white. She has humans you control have tap, add 1 mana of any of this creature's colors, and by paying 4 green-white and tapping, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So Katilda is kind of like a Cryptolith right in your command zone for a human tribal deck. And obviously, that can be an incredibly impactful and very powerful thing. With a ton of tiny humans in your deck that don't really cost much to get out, you can generate an absurd amount of mana very, very quickly. I mean, turn 1, play a 1 mana human, turn 2, play your commander, and then also tap that 1 mana human that you got out for another 1 mana human, and now next turn you have 3 mana dorks in play and it's only turn 3. And obviously, in these colors, there are plenty of big spells that you can take advantage of, and also some major untapped spells that can just untap your entire team so you can tap them again for mana, and yeah, this is just a very powerful commander when set up properly. So for this Cryptolith right / kind of like a Mana Weft Sliver or a Gemhide Sliver in your command zone, Katilda, you are starting off the A tier. Next up, let's move on to another Selesnya commander with Kyler, Sigardian Emissary. Kyler is a 2/2 human cleric for 3 green-white. Kyler has, whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Kyler, Sigardian Emissary. And other humans you control get +1/+1 for each counter on Kyler. So, just as Katilda is kind of like a Cryptolith right, but for a human tribal deck, Kyler is kind of like a Door to Destinies for a human tribal deck, but even better. Because the major difference between, say, a Door to Destinies and Kyler is that this counts when humans enter the battlefield, not when they're cast. Because of that, most importantly, Kyler is going to be counting when tokens come into play. I mean, with this commander, you can literally just win the game out of pretty much nowhere. Maybe right before your turn, cast something like Call the Coppercoats and create a ton of human tokens at instant speed. Again, say you get 10 or so tokens, all those come into play, you get 10 counters on this commander, and now all those tokens get +10/+10. You just went from having just your commander on the board to the largest army on the board by far. Maybe cast an Overrun or something like an Overwhelming Stampede or give them some form of evasion, and yeah, you win. And even without generating a ton of tokens, there are a lot of effective humans that you can pick from in these colors, so yeah, this commander definitely has a lot of potential and most definitely, in my opinion, belongs in the A tier. And speaking of potential, let's talk about Tovolar Dire Overlord / Tovolar the Midnight Scourge. Tovolar is a 3/3 human werewolf for 1 red-green. He has whenever a wolf or werewolf you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more wolves and or werewolves, it becomes night, then transform any number of human werewolves you control, and of course it has Daybound. And then on the night side, we've got a 4/4 werewolf that says that exact same thing as the front, where you draw a card whenever wolves or werewolves deal combat damage to a player. But on top of that, by paying X2 and a green, target wolf or werewolf you control gets +X+0 and gains trample until end of turn, so kind of like a Kessig wolf run, but without the tapping. So yeah, this commander does a ton for a werewolf tribal deck. First off, it provides you a massive amount of card advantage, whether it's on the front or the back, being essentially a coastal piracy or a reconnaissance mission for werewolves and wolves. And of course, also, it can actually transform your humans into werewolves, which again, the werewolf side is pretty much always going to be the more impactful side. And of course, it can also help you massively pump a creature or pump a couple of creatures and give them trample to get damage through. So yeah, Tovolar is a very solid commander and one that werewolf players have been waiting for a long time to see. So Tovolar, congratulations on your placement in the A tier. Next up in the A tier, we've got Gisa, Glorious Resurrector. Gisa is a 4/4 human wizard that costs 2 black, and she has if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. At the beginning of your upkeep, put all creature cards exiled with Gisa, Glorious Resurrector onto the battlefield under your control. They gain Decayed. So Gisa is a commander that I am definitely happy that they put some limitations on. One limitation is obviously that the creatures that you get decayed, so you can't block with them, and when you do attack, they go away. But the more important limitation is that you have to wait all the way until your upkeep to actually get those creatures. And because of that, Gisa needs to stay in play. So even if you cast something like a Plague Wind and destroyed all of your opponent's creatures, there's no guarantee that you're actually going to be getting them. Because if just one player has a removal spell and takes out Gisa, well, those creatures are just gone forever. And again, I am most definitely happy that there's that limitation, because if not, we could have had another Tergrid on our hands. So, unlike the God of Salt Tergrid, I am happy that Gisa has those limitations and that she is solidly in the A tier. Without those limitations, she obviously would have been incredibly overpowered and been bumped up to the S tier. And in the final spot in the A tier, we've got Slogurk the Overslime. Slogurk is a 3/3 ooze with trample that costs 1 green-blue. It says whenever a land is put in your graveyard from anywhere, put a +1/+1 counter on Slogurk the Overslime. By removing 3 counters from Slogurk, you return it to its owner's hand. And when Slogurk leaves the battlefield, return to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand. So like the Gitrog monster, keep in mind that Slogurk counts when lands hit your graveyard from anywhere. So that counts, say, when you sacrifice a fetch land, mill a land into your graveyard, or even discard a land card. Obviously, the more lands that hit your graveyard, the bigger Slogurk gets, and you're able to actually remove some of those counters to bounce it back to your hand. And with the way that it's written, remember that it's when it leaves the battlefield, so even if you're not bouncing it back to your hand, you could be blinking it, etc, etc. Regardless, it's basically a life from the loam. So yeah, there are some incredible land synergies that you can utilize with this commander, and in my opinion, it is most definitely a solid A tier commander with the right build. But now it's time for us to move up from the A tier to the most powerful commanders from the set and the pre-cons with the S tier commanders. And to start off the S tier commanders, we also have a commander that's got an S tier name with Old Stick Fingers. Yeah, that name I never expected in Magic, and it's pretty awesome. Regardless, it's a star horror that costs X black-green. It says, when you cast this spell, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards. Put all creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard, then put the rest of them on your library in a random order. Old Stick Fingers' power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So essentially, if you build your deck in a certain way where you only have specific creatures in it, say maybe 2 or 3 creatures that combo together, you can always get those creatures into your graveyard with this. And of course, since you're in these colors, you've got plenty of ways to reanimate those creatures, and yeah, you just basically get out a 2 or 3 creature combo and you win the game. For example, it only costs you 4 mana in total to get Mikaeus and Triskelion, some notorious combo creatures, into your graveyard every single time. Again, if your deck only has 2 creatures, you're always going to be getting them. And in these colors, obviously you've got ways to ramp, but also you've got ritual spells, so you can do this very quickly. So yeah, in my opinion, with the combo potential of Old Stick Fingers, it is most definitely an S tier commander. But now let's move on to a different kind of commander, but one that is still very much solidly in the S tier with Lier, Disciple of the Drowned. Lier is a 3/4 human wizard that costs 3 blue, and it says spells can't be countered. On top of that, each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback. That flashback cost is equal to that card's mana cost. So this is definitely a very unique mono blue commander because it's a commander that doesn't allow you to counter your opponent's spells. But on top of that, obviously, they can't counter yours either. So you are giving up some control in a way, but you're also protecting yourself from your opponents countering your spells. And believe me, your opponents are definitely going to want to counter some of the incredibly broken things that you can do with this commander, but they won't be able to. Giving every single instant and sorcery card in your graveyard flashback is incredible. I mean, even just consider an extra turn spell that doesn't exile itself. Yeah, with this commander, you get that twice, and your opponents can't counter it. Also consider that in mono blue, you've got access to plenty of spells that can copy a spell. On top of that, you've also got access to spells that can recur instants and sorceries from your graveyard and get them back to your hand. So thanks to this commander, you can overutilize certain spells with those copy effects and those recur effects, so yeah, it's going to be really tough for your opponents to stop you, especially when they can't counter what you're doing. Cast an extra turn spell and copy it. Alright, now let's get that extra turn spell back from our graveyard with a recursion spell, then we recast it, then we copy it again, then we get it back from our graveyard again. And also in mono blue, you've got a card like High Tide, which can give you even more mana out of your island, so have fun. Yeah, it's going to be really tough for your opponents to stop you once you even get set up in the slightest. So Lier, Disciple of the Drowned, congratulations on making it to the S tier. And the final commander that I'm going to bring up in the S tier might be surprising to some, but I definitely think that Vadrik deserves to be right here in the S tier. Vadrik is a 1/2 human wizard for 1 blue-red. He has, if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Vadrik Astral Archmage enters the battlefield. Instant sorcery spells you cast cost X less to cast for X is Vadrik's power. And whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, put a +1 counter on Vadrik. So yes, Vadrik's power can grow throughout the game by getting counters on it when it switches between day or night to day. But Vadrik is not dependent on those counters because what matters is actually Vadrik's power, not how many counters are on it. And because of that, again in my opinion, Vadrik is most definitely worthy of being an S tier commander. There are plenty of spells that you can essentially cast to double up Vadrik's power for just 1 mana. Whether that's a spell that most definitely has a converted mana cost above 1, or more importantly an X spell, Vadrik is pretty much going to make all your spells just cost whatever pips they are. So you cast, say, an X pump spell to double up Vadrik's power, then you cast another one and another one just for 1 mana each, essentially just making Vadrik's power insane. Then you cast a massive draw spell, just for 1 mana, like a Stroke of Genius. Then maybe you cast something like a Brass's Bounty for even more mana, and again, that only costs you 1 mana to do, and then you draw more cards, then you pump Vadrik further, and yeah, this gets out of control incredibly quickly. You basically can just get Vadrik's massive power up to an incredible amount, and then yeah, just cast a massive X burn spell or a massive X force draw spell, and you win. And this can happen in absolutely no time. Again, once you get going, you can easily draw pretty much your entire library and do what you want and win. So yeah, compared to Old Stickfingers and Lier, Vadrik might be a more surprising pick for the S tier, but I most definitely think that Vadrik belongs here. And with that, that is every single commander from Innistrad Midnight Hunt and the precons ranked in my power tiers. And as this episode is coming to a close, I would love to hear from you, so in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on these power tier rankings are. Did I underrate certain commanders? Did I overrate certain commanders? Did I overrate Old Stickfinger's name? Let me know in the comments below, of course, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.